Julian Vance stood under the oppressive gray sky, the chill of the November air doing little to pierce the frozen numbness that had encased his heart. Funerals, he had long decided, were inefficient rituals. They were performative grief, a public spectacle that did nothing to alter the finality of loss. His mother, Eleanor Vance, was gone. The thought was a simple, hard fact, yet it felt distant, like a headline about a distant country's troubles. He was more preoccupied with the looming hostile takeover bid for a German tech firm, a deal his father would have closed with brutal precision. Julian felt the weight of that legacy, a crown of ice he wore every day. He adjusted the knot of his black silk tie, his gaze sweeping over the somber, black-clad crowd of mourners. They were a collection of the city's elite, bankers, politicians, and socialites, all present to pay their respects to the Vance matriarch and, more importantly, to be seen by the Vance heir. Beside him, his sister Caroline dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, a portrait of sorrowful elegance. Her grief, like her ambition, was a tool to be wielded. "It's a beautiful service, Julian," she whispered, her voice a carefully calibrated mix of sadness and strength. Mother would have approved of the turnout. Julian gave a curt nod, his thoughts already drifting back to a conference call scheduled for later that afternoon. His world was one of numbers, of profit margins, and strategic acquisitions. Emotion was a liability, a weakness his father had trained him to excise like a surgeon removing a tumor. He had learned the lesson well. He felt nothing. Or so he told himself. The formal service concluded, and the mourners began the slow, respectful migration toward the Vance estate for the reception. It was there, amidst the hushed conversations and the clinking of crystal glasses, that the world he knew, the cold, orderly world he had built around himself, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. A woman had just entered the grand foyer, hesitating by the doorway as if unsure of her welcome. With her were two small children, a boy and a girl, their hands held tightly in hers. The woman was Alara. 6 years. It had been 6 years since he had last seen her face, except in the recesses of his memory that he kept ruthlessly locked away. She looked different, yet achingly the same. The carefree light in her eyes, he remembered, was gone, replaced by a quiet resilience, a weariness that seemed to settle deep in her bones. Her simple black dress was modest, a stark contrast to the designer mourning wear that filled the room. But it was not Alara who held his gaze, not Alara who sent a tremor through the very foundation of his being. It was the children. They were small, perhaps 5 years old. They stood close to their mother, their identical, serious faces taking in the cavernous room with wide, curious eyes. And their eyes, they were his. Not a similar shade of blue, not a close approximation. They were the exact, unmistakable stormy gray blue of the Vance lineage. The same eyes that stared back at him from the mirror every morning. The same eyes that had belonged to his father. The timeline clicked into place in his mind with the cold, brutal sound of a vault door slamming shut. 6 years ago, 5-year-old children. The boy, bolder than his sister, let go of Alara's hand and took a tentative step forward. He pointed a small finger at the towering oil portrait of Julian's late father that hung in the foyer. Then, he turned and pointed that same finger directly at Julian. "Look, Mommy," the boy's voice, clear and high, cut through the somber hum of the reception. "He looks just like the man in the picture, just not so old." Alara's face went pale, and she quickly shushed him, pulling him back to her side. But the damage was done. Every head in the vicinity had turned. Conversations faltered. Caroline's perfectly sculpted mask of grief warped into one of pure, venomous shock. Julian felt the heavy crystal tumbler in his hand grow slick. He stared at the two small faces, mirror images of each other, and saw his own childhood features staring back at him. The boy's determined chin. The girl's thoughtful brow. It was undeniable. It was impossible. It was the truth. The whiskey glass slipped from his numb fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo the fracturing of his entire existence, a sharp, explosive crack that silenced the room. Shards of crystal skittered across the polished stone. He didn't notice. He couldn't look away from the children. His children. The word echoed in the silent, screaming void that had just opened up inside of him. The drive back to his penthouse was a blur. He navigated the city streets on pure instinct, his mind a maelstrom of shock and dawning horror. The sanitized version of his past he had curated for himself had been detonated. He left Caroline at the estate, ignoring her hissed questions, her demands to know what was going on. He needed to be alone in the cold, sterile silence of his home. His penthouse was a monument to his success, a glass-walled fortress in the sky overlooking the sprawling city. It was minimalist, impersonal, and breathtakingly expensive. It had always felt like a symbol of his power. Tonight, it felt like a cage. He walked past the modern art and the custom furniture, heading straight for his study. There, in the back of a filing cabinet, tucked away behind corporate records and acquisition proposals, was a small, unassuming box. He hadn't opened it in years. Inside were the last remnants of a life he had been convinced to discard. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. There on top was a photograph faded at the edges. It was of him and Alara on their wedding day, a small, impulsive ceremony at a city hall. He was smiling, a genuine, unburdened smile he hardly recognized. She was radiant, her head thrown back in laughter. They had been so young, so ridiculously in love. His father, Richard Vance, had called their marriage a catastrophic mistake. A brief, youthful folly. Caroline had been more direct, her words dripping with condescension. She had called Alara an opportunistic nobody, a blight on their family's impeccable name. They had been relentless, a unified front of disapproval and disappointment. Julian, fresh from business school and desperate for his father's approval, had been weak. He had allowed their poison to seep into his mind. He remembered the end. It had been swift and clinical. His father's lawyers had handled everything. They had presented him with a letter, purportedly from Alara, stating she had met someone else and wanted a divorce. They told him she had demanded a large, unseemly settlement. He had been devastated, but his pride, so carefully cultivated by his father, had been wounded more. He signed the papers they put in front of him without a second thought, eager to erase the humiliation, to prove he was his father's son after all. He never spoke to her again. He sifted through the box. A dried wildflower she had once tucked into his lapel. The divorce decree with a signature he now realized he had never truly examined. It looked off. The fluid, graceful loops of her name seemed stiff, forced. He had been told she filed it. Now, seeing it again, a cold suspicion began to creep into his veins. The intercom buzzed, startling him. It was the front desk. "Mr. Vance, your sister, Miss Caroline Vance, is here to see you." "Send her up," he said, his voice flat. He placed the lid back on the box just as the private elevator doors chimed, opening directly into his living room. Caroline swept in, her face a thunderous mask of indignation. "Julian, what on earth was that? You cause a scene, you shatter a glass, and then you just disappear? And that woman, how dare she show her face at our mother's funeral?" "She came to pay her respects," Caroline, Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Respects?" Caroline scoffed, a bitter, ugly sound. "She came to cause trouble. You looked like you'd seen a ghost. Was it seeing her again? It's been years. I thought you were over it. Father was right to get her out of your life when he did. She would have ruined everything we've built, everything he built." Her words, meant to be a reminder of their shared legacy, now sounded like an admission. Get her out of your life. It wasn't that Alara had left, it was that she had been removed. The pieces were beginning to connect, forming a picture far uglier than he could have imagined. "I need you to leave, Caroline," he said, turning to face her. His expression was one she had never seen before, not the detached coldness of a CEO, but the frigid calm of impending fury. She was taken aback. "Julian, I'm just trying to." "Leave," he repeated, the single word sharp as a shard of the glass he had dropped. She stared at him for a moment, then turned on her heel and stormed back into the elevator, her outrage palpable. The moment the doors closed, Julian was on the phone. Not to his lawyers, not to his broker, but to Marcus Thorne, the head of his corporate security. Thorne was a former intelligence operative, a man who could find a whisper in a hurricane. "Marcus," Julian said, his voice tight. "I have a job for you. It's personal. And it's top priority." "Whatever you need, Julian," came the calm, professional reply. "I need you to find everything you can about a woman named Alara Hayes. She used to be Alara Vance. I need to know where she's lived for the past 6 years, where she works, everything. Most importantly, I need a current address. I need it now." He paused, the next words tasting like ash in his mouth. "And I want you to be invisible. No one can know you're looking." "Consider it done," Marcus said. "I'll be in touch." Julian hung up and stared out at the glittering city lights, lights that suddenly seemed cold and mocking. He had lived in a world of lies, a gilded prison constructed by his own family. And somewhere out there, in that sprawling metropolis, were 2 children with his eyes, living a life he couldn't begin to imagine. His children. Less than 2 hours later, his phone rang. It was Marcus. "I have the information," Marcus said, his voice devoid of emotion but with an undercurrent Julian could detect, surprise. "The address is for a unit in the Oakwood Terrace apartments over in the West Borough. It's a low-income housing district." Julian's stomach tightened. "Oakwood Terrace? He knew the area by reputation only. It was a part of the city his limousine driver was implicitly instructed to avoid. But there's more, Marcus continued, his voice lowering slightly. I started with the public records, the divorce. Julian, the signature on the decree. My preliminary analysis suggests it's a high-quality forgery. There's also no record of any financial settlement being paid out to her. According to the banks, the large sum your father's office claimed she demanded and received, it never went to her. She walked away with absolutely nothing. The phone felt heavy in Julian's hand. Forged. No settlement. She hadn't left him for money. She hadn't left him at all. She had been cast out, penniless, and pregnant with his children. The cold numbness that had protected him for so long finally cracked, and a wave of guilt so profound it nearly buckled his knees washed over him. He had been a fool. A blind, arrogant fool. And his children had paid the price for his ignorance every single day of their lives. The next morning, Julian did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He chose his own clothes. He bypassed the rows of bespoke suits and designer labels, pulling out a pair of simple dark jeans, a plain gray sweater, and a worn leather jacket he'd had since before he was a CEO. He looked at his reflection and saw a stranger, or perhaps a ghost of the man he used to be. He took the keys not to his chauffeured sedan or his Italian sports car, but to a nondescript, dark blue SUV he kept for incognito trips. He drove himself across the city, away from the gleaming towers and manicured parks of his world and into the gritty, struggling heart of the West Borough. The Oakwood Terrace apartments were even more grim in person than he had imagined. The brick facade was stained with grime and several windows were cracked. A group of teenagers loitered near the entrance, eyeing his clean car with suspicion. This was where Lara lived. This was where his children were growing up. He parked a block away and walked towards the building. In a small, patchy courtyard littered with weeds, he saw them. Leo and Lily. They were trying to ride a small, bright red bicycle, but the back tire was completely flat, making it wobble precariously. They were taking turns, one pushing the other, their faces etched with a shared, serious frustration. Julian's heart constricted. He who could buy a fleet of private jets without a second thought had children who were struggling with a single, broken bicycle. He approached them slowly, not wanting to frighten them. Looks like you've got a flat tire there, he said, his voice softer than he intended. Leo looked up at him, his gaze wary but direct. We know. The pump is broken. Maybe I could help, Julian offered. I'm pretty good with things like this. Lily hid behind her brother, peering out at Julian with those impossibly familiar eyes. Leo considered him for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Do you have tools? I have a kit in my car, Julian said. I can go get it. Leo gave a solemn nod of approval. Okay. As Julian walked back to his car, he felt a strange sense of unreality. He was the CEO of Vance Global, a man whose time was measured in thousands of dollars per minute, and he was about to fix a child's bicycle in a rundown courtyard. And it felt more important than any business deal he had ever made. He returned with the toolkit and knelt on the cracked pavement. As he worked to patch the inner tube, he witnessed a small, quiet scene that would be seared into his memory forever. Ilara appeared at the door of their ground-floor apartment holding an apple. She called the twins over. She carefully cut the apple in half with a small knife, giving one piece to Leo and the other to Lily. They thanked her and ate it with a serious appreciation that spoke of scarcity. One apple shared between two. In his penthouse, there was a bowl of organic fruit replenished daily by his staff that he rarely ever touched. The guilt was a physical thing now, a lead weight in his stomach. Through the open apartment door, he caught a glimpse of their home. It was impossibly small, probably no bigger than his walk-in closet. But it was spotless. A child's drawing was taped to the wall. A small pot of herbs sat on the windowsill. It was a home filled with love and care, if nothing else. He finished patching the tire and used his portable pump to inflate it. Leo watched his every move, his expression intense. How did you learn to do that? He asked. My dad taught me, Julian said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. His own father had never taught him anything so practical. He had taught him about hostile takeovers and leveraging assets. Our dad's gone, Leo stated simply, without sadness, as if reciting a fact from a book. Mommy says he was a good man, but he had to go far away. The words were a punch to the gut. Ilara had protected him. In their eyes, he wasn't a monster who had abandoned them. He was a good man who was simply gone. The generosity of that lie was more than he deserved. He stood up, brushing the dust from his jeans. There you go. Good as new. Leo gave the tire a professional-looking poke. Thank you, mister. You're welcome, Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. He needed to leave before he broke down completely. He started to walk away, his heart aching with a mixture of pain and a strange, budding warmth. He had only taken a few steps when he felt a tiny hand tug at the sleeve of his jacket. He turned. It was Lily, who had been silent the entire time. She was looking down at his hand, which was still smudged with grease from the bicycle chain. She gently touched his fingers with her own. Your hands look like Leo's hands, she whispered so quietly he had to lean in to hear. Her gaze lifted to meet his. Just bigger. It was not an accusation. It was a simple, innocent observation. But it struck him with the force of a final judgment. The resemblance. The undeniable genetic marker passed from father to son, now noticed by his own daughter. In her guileless eyes, he saw not only his reflection but also the crushing weight of his lie of omission. He wasn't just a helpful stranger. He was their father, and they were starting to see it. He turned and walked away, his mission no longer just about uncovering the past, but about fighting for a future he had almost thrown away. The fragile piece of Julian's new resolve was short-lived. He had underestimated his sister's vindictiveness. 2 days after his visit to Oakwood Terrace, he received a frantic call from an unknown number. It was Alara. Who is this? He answered, his tone sharp and professional. Julian? It's Alara. Her voice was trembling, tight with panic. There are people here. From Child Protective Services. They said they received an anonymous tip about me, that I'm an unfit mother, that my children are in an unsafe environment. Julian, I don't understand what's happening. Ice flooded Julian's veins. An anonymous tip. There was only one person who would be so cruel, so targeted. Caroline. She had discovered his visit and was striking back, not at him, but at the most vulnerable person in this equation. She was trying to scare Alara to use the threat of taking her children away to force her into silence and hiding. Stay calm, Alara, Julian said, his voice a low, dangerous command. Do not let them intimidate you. I'm on my way. I will handle this. He slammed the phone down, his mind racing. He called Marcus. Caroline made a move. She sent social services to Alara's apartment. Get me everything on the Vance private accounts going back 7 years. I want to know every dollar my father and sister moved that wasn't standard business. Pay special attention to any payments made to private investigators or lawyers. Specifically, find the lawyer who handled my divorce. I want to know where he is now. On it, Marcus replied. But Julian, there's something else you should know. I've been looking into your old correspondence files, the ones that were archived after the divorce. I found something. Scans of letters. Letters you wrote to Alara after she supposedly left, begging her to talk to you. They were marked undeliverable. Julian froze. He remembered writing them in a haze of grief and anger, pouring his heart out only to be told by his father's staff that they were all returned, her address unknown. There's more, Marcus continued. I cross-referenced archived mail logs from her old apartment building. She sent you letters, too, Julian? At least 5 of them in the weeks following the separation. They were all intercepted at the Vance Global mailroom and diverted directly to your father's office. You never saw them. The conspiracy was deeper, more personal, more profoundly cruel than he had ever imagined. They hadn't just lied to him, they had actively censored his life, building a wall of deceit around him, ensuring he and Alara could never find their way back to each other. He felt a surge of white-hot rage and anger so pure it was clarifying. This was no longer just about making amends. This was about tearing down an empire of lies. When Julian arrived at Oakwood Terrace, he found a stern-faced woman in a drab suit speaking with a terrified Alara in the cramped hallway outside her apartment. The children were peeking out from behind Alara's legs, their eyes wide with fear. I'm Mrs. Davis, the social worker said, turning her severe gaze on Julian. And you are? I'm a friend of the family, Julian said smoothly, stepping between her and Alara, creating a protective barrier. May I have a word with you in private? He led Mrs. Davis a few feet down the hall. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He simply laid out a fraction of the truth. My name is Julian Vance. Alara Hayes is my ex-wife. I have reason to believe this anonymous tip was a malicious act placed by a member of my own family to harass her. I am in the process of rectifying a grave injustice that was done to her years ago. Mrs. Davis's expression flickered. The Vance name carried weight. But she was no fool. Mr. Vance, my only concern is the welfare of those children. As is mine, Julian said, his sincerity palpable. Look at them. Look at their home. They are loved. They are cared for. This is a cruel game being played by powerful people. All I'm asking for is time. File your report. See that there is no basis for this claim. And please trust that I am doing everything in my power to secure a safe and stable future for them. Mrs. Davis studied him for a long moment. She had seen real neglect, real abuse. This wasn't it. This felt different, wrong? She glanced back at Alara's clean but threadbare apartment, at the two bright, healthy children. She made a decision. I will conduct my assessment as required by law, she said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly. My report will reflect what I have seen here today. A loving mother and two well-cared-for children, she was offering him an opening, an alliance. She would file a glowing report burying Caroline's malicious attempt in bureaucracy. Thank you, Julian said, a wave of relief washing over him. But the reprieve was temporary. That evening, Caroline, furious that her plan had failed, came to his penthouse. She dispensed with all pretense. I know you went there again, Julian, she spat, her voice tight with rage. I warned you. Stay away from her. You're going to drag the Vance name through the mud. Father built an empire on a reputation of strength and integrity. You will not tear it down for some gutter snipe and her brats. Do not, Julian said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, ever call my children that name again. Caroline laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. Your children? Are you insane? They are nothing. A mistake. An inconvenience that father and I cleaned up for you. She stepped closer, her eyes glittering with malice. You need to be careful, Julian. It would be a terrible shame if something were to happen to them. Accidents happen in those neighborhoods all the time. A faulty gas line, a fire. It would be a tragedy. The threat hung in the air between them, naked and horrifying. This was no longer about social standing or family reputation. This was a promise of violence against his children. The last vestige of brotherly affection he might have harbored for his sister evaporated in that single, monstrous moment. She was his enemy, and he would destroy her before he let her lay a hand on his family. The battle lines were drawn. The next day, Julian summoned Caroline to the main boardroom at Vance Global. It was a place of immense power, the heart of their family's empire, with a mahogany table long enough to land a plane on and a wall of glass overlooking the city. When Caroline arrived, she found Julian was not alone. Marcus Thorne stood silently by the head of the table, his presence as imposing as the room itself. What is this, Julian? Caroline asked, attempting an air of bored authority. If this is another lecture, I'm not interested. Sit down, Caroline, Julian said. His voice was calm, but it held the chilling finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. He gestured to the massive screen on the wall, which flickered to life. The first image was a high-resolution scan of the divorce decree, Alara's forged signature circled in red. The next was a detailed report from a forensic document examiner confirming the forgery. Then came the bank statements, a clear, undeniable trail of money moving from a Vance private account into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. A corporation owned by Richard Vance's personal lawyer. Caroline's composure began to fray. A faint sheen of sweat appeared on her upper lip. Julian wasn't finished. He projected scans of the letters. First, one of his own, the handwriting desperate, pleading with Alara for an explanation. Then one of hers, the ink slightly blurred as if by tears, telling him she was pregnant and that she loved him, begging him to call. These were intercepted, Julian stated, his voice echoing slightly in the vast room. By your and father's specific instructions to the mailroom supervisor. You didn't just lie to me, you actively silenced her. You buried her. Cornered, trapped by irrefutable evidence. Caroline did not crumble or beg for forgiveness. She did something far more shocking. She straightened her spine, a sneer twisting her lips. The mask of civility fell away, revealing the raw, ugly ambition beneath. I did it for you, she hissed, her voice rising. For us, for this family. Do you have any idea how much work father and I did to build this legacy? This name, and you were going to throw it all away on her. A waitress, a nobody from a background so common it was embarrassing. She would have been an anchor around your neck, diluting our bloodline, spending our money, weakening everything we stand for. Her eyes blazed with a righteous fire, the conviction of a zealot. Father knew it. He saw the weakness in you, the sentimentality. I helped him. I did what had to be done to protect you, to protect our family's future from your own bad judgment. I would do it again. There was no remorse, no flicker of guilt. only the chilling certainty that she had been right, that her cruelty had been a necessary act of preservation. In that moment, Julian saw her for what she truly was, a monster cloaked in designer suits and family loyalty. He looked at her, and all he felt was a profound, hollow pity. "You talk about family," he said, his voice now devoid of all heat, filled only with a glacial coldness. "You are not my family. My family is a woman whose life you tried to systematically destroy. My family are 2 innocent children you threatened and called brats. This company, this legacy you're so desperate to protect, it was built on a foundation of lies. Your lies." He nodded to Marcus, who picked up the desk phone and pressed a single button. "Security to the main boardroom." Immediately. Caroline's eyes widened in disbelief. "What are you doing?" "I'm cleaning house," Julian said. He stood up, towering over her. "As of this moment, you are removed from the board of directors of Vance Global. Your access to this building is revoked. Your corporate accounts are frozen. You are to be escorted from the premises. Do not contact me. Do not attempt to contact Ilara or the children. If you do, I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure you are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Security officers arrived, their faces impassive. Caroline stared at Julian, her expression a mixture of fury and shock. "You can't do this. This is my company too. Father would never. Father is gone." Julian cut her off. "And his way of doing things is over," he watched, his face a stone mask, as the guards led his sputtering, protesting sister out of the boardroom and out of his life. That night, Julian drove back to Oakwood Terrace. He didn't bring tools or pretense this time. He brought the truth. He found Ilara putting the children to bed, reading them a story in their small, cozy living room. She sent them off with kisses and came to the door, her expression wary. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly. "Can I come in?" She hesitated, then nodded, letting him into the home he now knew his own family had sentenced her to. He didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of the room and laid out the entire sordid story. He told her about the forged signature, the stolen settlement, the intercepted letters. He told her about his father's manipulations and Caroline's deep-seated jealousy. He told her about the social services call and the final, horrifying threat his sister had made. He pulled a folded, worn piece of paper from his pocket. It was a scan of the last letter he had written, the one he thought she had ignored. "I was a fool, Ilara," he said, his voice raw with a shame that was 6 years in the making. "I was a coward. They told me you left me for another man, that you only wanted money, and I was so weak and so desperate for my father's approval that I believed them. I let my pride blind me to the woman I knew you were." Tears streamed down Ilara's face as she listened, silent tears for the life they had lost, for the lies that had poisoned everything. "I can never take back the years they stole from us," Julian continued, his own eyes welling up. "I can never undo the hardship you faced, the struggles you've endured alone. I will live with that guilt for the rest of my life. But I am asking you now. I am begging you, let me be a father to our children. Let me protect you from them. Let me try to earn back a fraction of the trust one threw away." He finally looked her in the eye, his soul bare. "Let me be the man I should have been 6 years ago." The annual Vance Foundation Gala was the pinnacle of the city's social calendar, a night of performative philanthropy where millions were raised and reputations were made. Caroline, reeling but not yet defeated, saw it as her last stand. She was still on the foundation's board, a separate entity from the corporation, and she intended to use the platform. She would deliver a moving speech, announce a new wing for the city hospital named after their father, and paint Julian as an unstable, grief-stricken son trying to tarnish their family's immaculate legacy. She was certain he wouldn't dare create a scene at his own mother's tribute event. She was wrong. Julian arrived not in a somber black tuxedo, but in a dark gray suit, looking more like a man going to battle than a gala. And he was not alone. On his arm was Ilara, looking poised and beautiful in a simple, elegant navy dress he had insisted on buying for her. Holding their hands were Leo and Lily, scrubbed and polished, looking around the opulent ballroom with wide, curious eyes. The arrival sent a shockwave through the crowd. Whispers erupted like wildfire. The city's elite stared, their minds racing to connect the dots between the disgraced ex-wife from years ago and the 2 children who were miniature versions of the Vance CEO. Caroline, standing near the stage, saw them enter. Her face, already pale, turned ashen. This was not part of her plan. She watched in horror as Julian calmly guided his family to a table at the very front, a table reserved for him now occupied by the ghosts she had tried so hard to exorcise. When the time came for the keynote speeches, Caroline took the stage first, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke of her father's vision and her mother's charity. It was a valiant effort, but her eyes kept darting towards Julian's table. Then it was Julian's turn. He walked to the podium, the ballroom silent with anticipation. He looked out at the sea of expectant faces, the cameras broadcasting the event live to news feeds. He set aside the prepared remarks about the foundation's work. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady and clear, amplified throughout the hall. "Tonight we are here to honor my mother's memory and to talk about legacy. People in this room believe legacy is about wealth, about buildings with your name on them. For a long time I believed that too. I was wrong." He paused, letting the words sink in. "A true legacy is about truth. And for the past 6 years, my life and the legacy of the Vance family has been built on a terrible lie." A collective gasp went through the room. Caroline looked like she was about to faint. "6 years ago," Julian continued, his gaze finding Alara in the crowd, "I was married to a wonderful woman. I was told she left me. I was told she did it for money. I was told she wanted nothing more to do with me. All of it was a lie orchestrated by my late father and my sister, Caroline Vance." He gestured towards a stunned Caroline. "They forged divorce papers. They stole her settlement. They intercepted our letters to ensure we could never speak again. They cast her out, penniless, because they felt she wasn't good enough for the Vance name." The room was in an uproar. Julian held up a hand for silence. "But that is not the worst of their deception." He looked toward the side of the stage and nodded. Marcus Thorne stepped out from the wings, and he was not alone. Beside him was a nervous, sweating, middle-aged man. "This is Mr. Abernathy," Julian announced. "He was the lawyer my father and sister paid to handle the divorce. He fled the country shortly after, but he has agreed to come back and tell the truth." Marcus handed a microphone to Abernathy, whose hands were shaking. "It's all true," the lawyer stammered, his voice cracking. "Richard and Caroline Vance, they paid me a fortune. I hired a forger for the documents. I filed them through a contact in the courthouse. I was instructed to make sure Miss Hayes, Mrs. Vance, was left with nothing and no recourse. Then came the final, devastating blow." Abernathy took a deep breath. "There's more. Mrs. Vance had told them she was pregnant. Caroline Vance had me acquire her medical records through a private investigator. She knew. She knew about the pregnancy from the very beginning. She knew about the twins. And she buried it. She was willing to let her own brother's children be born into poverty and obscurity to protect what she called the family legacy." The revelation landed like a bomb. It was one thing to be cruel to an ex-wife, it was another monstrous thing entirely to knowingly abandon your own brother's children. The conspiracy was laid bare for the entire world to see. As if on cue, 2 uniformed police officers who had been waiting discreetly at the back of the ballroom began to walk purposefully toward the stage. They moved past the stunned guests, their faces grim. They walked directly up to Caroline, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "Miss Caroline Vance," one of the officers said, his voice formal and loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and forgery in front of the cream of society, in front of the live news cameras." They put her in handcuffs. Her public downfall was total, immediate, and absolute. In the ensuing chaos, Julian turned his back on the stage, on the wreckage of his former life. He walked through the stunned crowd directly to his table. He ignored the flashing cameras, the shouted questions from reporters. He had eyes only for his family. He knelt on the floor, bringing himself down to eye level with Leo and Lily, who looked frightened and confused by the commotion. He put a hand on each of their shoulders, shielding them from the storm he had unleashed. Alara knelt beside him, placing her hand over his. The cameras flashed, capturing the image not of a ruthless CEO or a vengeful brother, but of a father, on his knees, finally, publicly claiming his family. The empire of lies was in ruins, but in its place, something real and true was beginning to be built. 10 months later, the sun was setting over a large, sprawling lawn, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was filled not with the sound of city traffic, but with the chirping of crickets and the sound of children's laughter. Leo, now taller and more confident, swung a baseball bat, connecting with a soft pitch thrown by Julian. The ball sailed across the yard, and Leo rounded the makeshift bases with a triumphant yell. Nearby, on a large checkered blanket, Lily was meticulously explaining the complex social structure of her collection of dolls to Alara, who listened with rapt attention. This was their new normal. Julian had sold the cold, sterile penthouse in the city and bought a large, comfortable house in the countryside, a place with old trees to climb and endless grass to run on. A home, not just a house. Julian himself was a changed man. The perpetual tension in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a relaxed, easy posture. He wore jeans and a faded university sweatshirt, and he hadn't worn a tie in months. He was still the majority shareholder of Vance Global, but he had promoted a trusted, capable executive to handle the day-to-day operations of being CEO. He now worked from his home office 3 days a week, his schedule built around school pickups and baseball practice, not board meetings. His priorities had been irrevocably realigned. He had also fulfilled his promise to build a new legacy. He had completely restructured the Vance Foundation. Gone were the superficial galas and vanity projects. Its new, singular mission was to provide pro bono legal aid and financial support to victims of familial fraud and coercion, people who, like Alara, had been manipulated and disenfranchised by those they should have been able to trust. He had insisted the main building be renamed the Eleanor Vance Center. He liked to think his mother, whose love had been genuine even if it had been overshadowed by his father's ambition, would have adored her grandchildren and approved of this new direction. Caroline, after a lengthy trial, was serving a sentence in a minimum security prison, stripped of her name, her wealth, and her power. Later that evening, after the children were tucked into bed, Julian and Alara sat together on the wide porch swing, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the oak tree overhead. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable, forged in the fires of shared trauma and rebuilt with patience and forgiveness. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. It wasn't the ostentatious box from a world-famous jeweler he had used the first time. It was simple, discreet. He opened it. Inside was a single, elegant ring, a beautiful sapphire the color of Alara's eyes, flanked by 2 small, brilliant diamonds. "The diamonds are for Leo and Lily," he said softly. "The sapphire is for you." He turned to her, his expression earnest, vulnerable. "I know I can't undo the past, Alara. Not a day goes by that I don't regret my weakness, my foolishness. But I hope I've spent these last months proving that I am not that man anymore. I want to spend every day for the rest of my life proving my love to you and our children." He slipped the ring from the box. "Will you marry me, Alara? Again? Properly this time, with our children as our witnesses." Tears of pure joy welled in Alara's eyes and streamed down her cheeks. She nodded, unable to speak, and threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she whispered against his shoulder. "Yes, of course, yes." He held her close, the solid, warm reality of her in his arms a comfort he would never again take for granted. He looked out at the darkening yard where his children's toys lay scattered on the grass. He once thought his legacy was written in stock tickers and the soaring skylines of the cities he helped build. He knew now how wrong he had been. His real legacy was written in the echoes of his children's laughter, in the quiet strength of the woman in his arms, in the second chance he was given to build a family he had so foolishly, almost irrevocably, lost. That was the only fortune that ever truly mattered.